And we are live. So I'm just going to give everybody a few seconds for all the participants to join the meeting. But welcome to Lunchtime Live from the National Recruitment Federation in conjunction with our partners, Fenero. So we have had a huge amount of interest in this topic, contingent workforce management. So I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds to let the participants that are joining us live join the event. I know that people are going to be watching this live. Some people will watch it back later. And I think one thing that I'd like to say before we kick off formally is that although the trends in contingent workforce management are similar from country to country, the specific legislation that we're going to talk about today is going to relate to the Irish market, where we're going live from today. Super. So you can see the participant numbers are going up, and we're also going to, for the first time, try and stream this live to LinkedIn and YouTube. We're in the experimental phase with that, so I guess time will tell whether that happens or not. Fingers crossed. Okay, so to kick off, I've been asked to do a very brief introduction to Dave O'Reilly. Dave is Director of Tax at Fenero, and Dave's organization manages compliance, payroll, and all things for contractors. They manage thousands of contractors and have worked with recruitment agencies and staffing organizations for many years. So he's a qualified accountant, tax expert, and Dave is famous for making tax fun and jargon-free, or as fun as it can be. Dave, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much, Donal, and thank you very much for the kind introduction. Yes, tax should be fun, but more so kind of should be simple, easy to understand. So that's our objective. I'd like to give a big thank you to the NRF for having us here today. Fenero is delighted to sponsor the Lunchtime Live. I always want to say, talk to Joe. The subject matter, as you mentioned, Donal, it's very topical, very kind of hot at the moment, and that's kind of shown just by the sheer number of people who registered for the event. I think we had about 350 or close to 350 there kind of this morning, which is just amazing.
So I think what's really interesting as well, Dave, is that when we think about the year that we've just gone through, and you look at the staffing industry and you look at recruitment organizations, regardless of where they're based, the same questions are coming back all the time. And the businesses that tend to have survived and tend to thrive in downturns are the ones that have a contingent workforce strategy, that have either a decent temp book, a decent contractor book, because, you know, when an economic downturn happens, permanent recruitment can slow down very quickly. So that product mix of having a strong contract temp resourcing strategy is really, really important.
Yeah, I completely agree. And looking at the contingent models, both the temporary agency worker and the professional contractor, sometimes kind of they've been viewed kind of at different ends or kind of at odds with each other, but really they're just the two sides of the same coin. So both satisfying the client's need for a temporary skills gap. So from where we're sitting, kind of those two kind of desks are kind of come together with a lot of recruitment business that kind of we've been dealing with over the last 12 months. In terms of kind of the agenda for today, we're going to take a look at comparing and contrasting the temporary agency worker model and the professional contractor. There's benefits and considerations for both, which we're going to delve into. They both also kind of carry different levels of risk, which kind of we'll discuss both from the candidates, the recruitment business, and the client. And we're going to be kind of tapping into our resident recruitment guru, Donal, for his top tips in terms of kind of how to kind of approach these different kind of models. So kind of very much looking forward to kind of discussing that with you, Donal, getting your expertise. I think before we jump in, it'd be good just to set the backdrop for where we are in April 2021. So the use of contingent workers has increased year on year for the last number of years. And this is both from the end clients adopting contingent workforce and also kind of candidates kind of moving from perm across. So kind of was a steady increase up until 2020. The pandemic, do what pandemics do, to put a little bit of a pause on the increase kind of in contingent workforce. But Thankfully, from Fenero's perspective, and it'd be good to kind of touch base with you on this, Donal, we've seen a lot of green shoots of confidence coming back into the market in 2021, especially in March and April. The number of candidates new to contracting kind of has increased in terms of the inquiries, and also just comparing the number of inquiries we've received the first quarter compared to quarter one 2020 and even kind of 2019. So I definitely think there's a lot more confidence coming back into the market. We're not quite at the bounce, but hopefully we're coming up to seeing where the bounce might start. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think we've seen definitely over the past year, I think we've seen definitely a two-tier labour market emerge, and the trends are very similar across both Ireland and the UK. There are the sectors that have ground to a halt around, retail, hospitality, and that have had to really transition their business. And then in the knowledge economy, which is where a lot of the professional contractors tend to populate, there's been strong performance in life science, pharmaceutical, strong performance in financial services, IT and business change. And I think it's been encouraging to see the way businesses have adapted to resourcing and onboarding talent, whether permanent, temporary or contract professional contractors. It's been encouraging. I think people are nearly concerned to say that there's green shoots and that there's improvements because, we've had false starts. There have been improvements, and then there have been setbacks as restrictions had to be implemented again. But as we're now in April 2021 and we're beginning to see traction happening with the vaccine rollout and a bit of sunshine and a bit of better weather, I think there's definitely optimism there. So I think the next few months will be telling, and then I think the prospects economically look good for recovery. There's certainly pent up demand there.
I agree. I believe the kind of adoptance of remote working is also going to help. Doing a bit of research for this webinar, and the SIA did some studies, and they said that across all industries, remote working was 50% for all industries in 2020, up from 2% in 2019. And for the IT contingent sector, that was from 10% up to 90% in 2020. So definitely kind of remote working, I think, will help with contingent workers, especially kind of if you're looking at professional contractors, because the talent pool is not just national, it increases to worldwide when you kind of look at kind of the professional contractor, provided kind of the contractor is compliant in their domestic country. So I think, and
that's the key point, Dave, isn't it? Because I think what happened when lockdown hit initially and people realized that they could work remotely, we had people work remotely, we had some people work from home, and then we had some people that returned to maybe where their country of origin, started delivering services from there because they thought that it was going to be a relatively short thing. And then as HR teams and compliance department realized where the duties of the role were being delivered and where tax compliant in terms of payroll taxes and so on, I think then we saw organizations say, okay, everybody come back and make sure that the role is being delivered from where you're tax resident from. I don't know if you guys in Fenero have seen much of that, or...
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I think for remote working to continue in the contingent workforce, compliance is the key. Compliance is the key because a lot of our contractors, they went kind of home to their domestic countries, but those domestic countries didn't really have a well-developed tax and accounting system for contractors. There's no kind of umbrella companies, or sometimes kind of it's really difficult and expensive to set up a limited company, which is preventing them from working from home from those countries. So there's definitely kind of a challenge and an opportunity in relation to that.
Cool.
As we're kind of starting off, and this is something that we've come across more frequently over the last 12 months, is where a candidate comes to us and are given two offers by the agency. So an offer to go as a temporary agency worker, and also then an offer to be a professional contractor. And the agency is allowing the candidate to decide which one they want to go with. So we'll go through the figures and stuff like that. And then the candidate will go off and take all the external factors, the retention into consideration and make their decision. For me, sometimes I struggle to understand what's the common policy for recruitment businesses in deciding whether somebody should go with a temp or somebody go with a professional contractor. I suppose I want to put that to you. Is there common internal policies? Should there be common internal policies in making that decision?
That's a really, really good question, because when, there's no simple answer to it. So I'll put it this way. Sometimes an organization identifies a non-permanent need. So for example, they need to bring in a particular skill set or particular resource, maybe to deliver a project or to fill a gap, like for example, a maternity leave or something like that. So on some occasions, the hirer will come to the recruitment company and they'll say, look, we need to bring somebody in. I don't have permanent headcount, but can we put somebody on your books? And that was the old-fashioned way of saying it. Can we have somebody who's not on our payroll effectively? So it's a variable cost rather than a fixed payroll cost. The decision there can sit with the recruitment company, and the recruitment company will typically look at what the skills that are needed are. So for example, if it is a specific IT contractor, a developer, a project manager, or something like that, and we know that that population of talent have a tendency to work as professional contractors on a day rate, and we know what the rate card is and so on like that, we will tend to source talent in that particular area. If it's perhaps maybe a more junior position, or if it's a position that tends to, where talent tends to work through kind of an agency temporary model, we might look in that area. And then the other case is, and I think we'll go through this when we compare and contrast the two models, there's different legislation that surrounds the two models. So for example, I know in our organization, we work with a number of public sector and semi-state clients where they want to only bring in temporary agency workers because they want the protection of the Protection of Employees Act 2012 that relates to temporary agency workers, which has the principle of equal treatment, which means that were the organization bringing in a permanent person on a certain salary with a certain level of annual leave, if they bring in somebody to fill the gap through an agency, that person needs to have equal treatment, similar salary level, similar level of annual leave, and so on like that. So the decision may sit with the client. So you might have some organizations that only want to bring in temporary agency workers. Sometimes it'll sit with the recruitment organization where they'll look at the skills that are needed and they'll figure out where that candidate population actually resides. Is this a skill set, for example, if an organization was looking to bring in a senior strategic marketer, it might be a question that that person is a professional contractor. If you're looking to bring in, for example, a finance assistant to cover a maternity leave, that might be somebody on a salary on an agency temp basis. So it really depends. It can be driven by the client organization, or it can be seriously influenced by the recruitment company. And actually, the recruitment company needs to think about the liability and the legislation that will apply not only to the recruitment organization, to the end hirer as well, because depending on what liability we're talking about, different legislation applies to different organizations in terms of who is deemed to be the employer.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a quite comprehensive answer. And for someone who's a little bit maybe kind of biased from the professional contractor, it seems like for the recruitment business, there's a whole load more work to do kind of with the temporary in terms of kind of managing the payroll, holidays pay, as opposed to kind of paying an invoice from a contractor. It might be good if we kind of take a look at comparing the temporary agency worker and the professional contractor just across a few different kind of headings.
Mm-hmm.
So I could start at the start. Obviously, the contract type is very important because the legislation kind of flows down from that. With your temp, you have the contract of service. Everyone's familiar with what an employment contract is. And for the professional contractor, obviously, you have the contract for service. It's fairly straightforward. I think you touched on it there with kind of the legislation, Donal. There seems to be kind of, there's quite a lot in that kind of middle box compared to kind of what's in the right box. Obviously, it goes from unfair dismissals, redundancy payments, right down to what you touched on, which is kind of the Temporary Agency Workers Act 2012. Can't believe that's 9 years old now. Whereas you're looking at the professional contractor, it's primarily contract law. Obviously, you have health and safety kind of obligations on both sides, but contract law is really one that kind of governs the relationship with the contractor and the agency, or the contractor and the client.
Yeah. What's interesting with this, Dave, as well, is that if you think about that list of employment legislation that applies to the temporary agency worker, responsibility for example, for unfair dismissals or for health and safety legislation, that's deemed to be the responsibility of the hirer, the end user, or the company for whom the tasks and the work is actually delivered. For all other legislation, the entity that pays the wages, i.e. the recruitment company or the employment agency, is deemed to be the employer. So it's quite an interesting one, because even that decision that happens between the hirer and the employment agency, there's a level, now albeit a relatively small level, but a level of liability can be conferred onto the hirer at this point, whether the decision is to go with the temp or to go with a contractor.
Yep, and you touched on it's there, the Temporary Agency Worker Act. Obviously, kind of, it's addressing the equal treatment principle surrounding pay, kind of, and annual leave and so forth, and access to facilities. Whereas the professional contractor, if the worker is the beneficial owner of the company, so if they kind of are shareholder in the company, the Temporary Agency Worker Act doesn't apply to them. So for contractors using their own limited company or director of an umbrella company, that's not applicable. From someone who operates kind of a temp business, how much does the Temporary Agency Worker Act come into kind of the day-to-day operations?
How much what? Sorry,
how much does the Temporary Agency Worker Act come in? Is it kind of, does it impact your operations and kind of how you carry out placing temps?
Yeah, what's really important when it comes to that, when an organization wants to bring in a temporary agency worker, it's making sure, and I think, to be fair, we're 10 years or more into this now since the directive came out that was transposed into law in 2012. So organizations, in my experience, are very good. So they understand the concept of equal treatment. And so what the agency needs to do is to make sure that when they're taking a requirement or taking a requisition from their client, that they ask the questions in terms of, if this person were being taken on directly, what would the comparable salary be? And what the level of annual leave would be. And if there are any other benefits that are relevant, that fall within the legislation. And they also need to document that. So typically it's a very simple one-page form that is carried out as you take the requirement, confirm it back to the client, and then it's just about building out and accruing the correct costs, because it does have an impact on the working time regulation amount that you need to accrue for annual leave and holiday entitlement.
Okay. From the candidate's perspective, historically possibly more common in particular industries, as you mentioned, possibly shorter term contracts or lower daily rates, but not necessarily. Big benefit for them is, okay, holiday pay, public holiday pay kind of included as standard, and they don't have to go off and find an umbrella company provider or an accountant to look after kind of the payroll. So everything is handled by the agency. What we find kind of more with the professional contractor, it's really kind of the big benefit is the tax planning, the ability to claim expenses, and really kind of the ability to kind of have an impact over their retention, which can be attractive to a lot of people in this sector. And the IT, engineering, pharmaceutical kind of will be very common there. From recruitment business, obviously kind of a little bit more of operational requirements to operate the payroll. You guys got to be mindful of the long contracts, so 23 months brings the redundancy payments into consideration, and also kind of the Temporary Agency Workers Act. With kind of temps that are approaching the 23 months time frame, Donal, kind of how do you guys kind of approach that with the client?
So typically what tends to happen is, depending on the organization, most organizations won't allow a temporary agency worker to continue for a duration more than 23 months. So, because the idea with the temporary agency worker is that it is a resource to come in and to complete a piece of work or to fill a potential gap. So we often see situations where somebody's brought in on a 9-month contract extended to 12 months. And I think one of the things that's very positive is that when people go into an organization and add value, they make a home for themselves. So it can become kind of a rolling contract. But as it's coming close to the 2-year mark, you're absolutely correct. At 24 months, there's the protection of the redundancy legislation. So at that point, I think organizations either look to see whether the person may convert to a permanent role in that organization, or may look to move the person to a different assignment. But I think that's one of the decisions when the recruitment consultant is making the decision on whether to suggest a temporary agency worker or a professional contractor. For example, if the contract was to deliver an 18-month contract to do a piece of IT work, for example, or a program of work, and if there's a high probability that that may extend, well, then in that case, it may be better to suggest a professional contractor, because the professional contractor isn't covered or affected by that piece of legislation. So the ability to extend for an additional 6 or 12 months is a possibility in that case. So that's definitely one of the deciding factors that I know recruitment consultants would think about. Okay,
that makes sense. On the professional contractor side, obviously compliance is very important. Making sure that the contractor, kind of their company, is VAT registered, or if they're dealing with UK personal service companies, that's they're taking IR35 into consideration, which I'm sure everyone is fully aware of, since it went live on April the 6th. And then finally, just from the client's perspective, as you mentioned, kind of they may have equal treatment requirements, especially if they're state or semi-state. They do have to be mindful kind of health and safety and the unfair dismissal rules. But I suppose kind of if they're pushing this one, really they may want peace of mind. Whereas on the professional contractor side, kind of it's more compliance. They're probably indifferent as long as the job is getting done. They're probably happy. Is that how those conversations normally go?
It really depends, and it really depends at the level of maturity that the organization is at when it comes to managing their contingent workforce or their non-permanent population. And this is the interesting one. When you think about it, over the past 20 years, we've seen a situation go from where organizations really didn't have any visibility in terms of their non-permanent resource to where now organizations are using supplier relationship management to very carefully manage it. So let me give you kind of an example of that. I think if you went back to the late 90s, early 2000s, in an organization, you had the permanent employees, the full-time equivalents, and where there was the need to bring in temporary agency workers, the human resources department typically would work very closely on that, because permanent, fixed-term contracts and temporary agency workers all sit under similar legislation, and they're all kind of deemed as either the permanent or variable workforce. Where you had rogue spend and a lack of visibility is because a professional contractor is providing a contract for services, they were residing in every corner of a business. So you might have the board bringing in a consultant that was issuing invoices for days worked and so on like that. You might have had, for example, with IT, integration, separation, migration projects or programs of work, where the ability to resource a piece of work is sitting as a line item in an IT budget, for example. So I know in some organizations, the HR team would not even want visibility in the old days of the contract resource that was brought into different parts of the business. Equally, you might see it in marketing, you might see it in finance, where it was coming up to year end and there would be a need to bring in extra help to meet a busy period of time. And what happened then that was really interesting is procurement got involved, because they realized that actually, first of all, there wasn't visibility of the spend. There were, in some larger organizations, literally hundreds of different contracts with different terms, different liability clauses, different margins being paid to some very expensive consultants. And then when you think about day rate contractors being provided by agencies, there could have been a range in the margin applied. There could have been a 10 or 15% difference in margin applied from one contractor to another. There could have been differences in notice periods, and the compliance piece was really out of the control of the end hirer. And I remember in some organizations going in to look at their non-permanent resource, and many years ago finding some sole traders that had been providing services that just needed to be brought into a program. So I think what happened that was really effective, as procurement became involved and procurement and HR started to look at this whole concept of a contingent workforce, we started to get really good synergies in terms of like before there was ever any MSP solution, it was just about, can we get a master service agreement or a master contract in place? So we've got the same notice period for all professional contractors in their contract, that we can have kind of visibility in terms of the commercials, that there was an element of rate card management, because you could have one contractor providing services on one side of the business and somebody on the other side providing very similar services with a difference of maybe 100 or 150 euros per day. And when you're thinking about organizations that might have hundreds of professional contractors with an average day rate of maybe 500 euros or 500 pounds or $500, we're talking contingent workforce spend in the tens of millions. So the savings in actually putting manners on this and having procurement and HR working together were what really started this whole evolution of VMS and managed service provision. And I think just in terms of the terminology, because I know we have some people that are fairly new to the recruitment profession and the staffing industry on the call, and I know we have some very experienced people as well, but the terminology managed service provider is the term that we use when an organization outsources all of its non-permanent hiring, whether temporary agency workers and professional contractors or just professional contractors, to a third party. And RPO, recruitment process outsourcing, is the term we use when an organization outsources its permanent hiring to a third party. And then the total talent management is the hybrid of the two, which we're seeing a real development in the, more so in Europe than in North America. North America, they tend to keep it very separate, MSP and RPO very separate, but that's just in terms of the terminology piece, just to help people with that bit.
So listening to that and just thinking, if we say that clients are going to increasingly take on more contingent workers, I'm talking about the larger clients here, would it make sense then for them to really move towards kind of an MSP or kind of a hybrid kind of MSP, and then kind of have, rather than kind of have a vendor neutral policy for contingent workforce?
It depends on the organization. It depends on I think it's very difficult to go from having no contingent kind of strategy to go into a full MSP. Sure. Although, as you were saying, the SIA has done some interesting research, and RPO and MSP are two of the largest growth sectors in the staffing industry globally. And what's interesting is the majority of MSP business that's being written at the moment is for organizations that didn't have an MSP program in the past. That's not to say they didn't have supplier relationship management, but it's certainly the way that that things are evolving. And that's why I think this is probably why there was so much interest in today's conversation, because if you're a recruitment company, whether you're a small specialist or whether you have aspirations to win some MSP business, you must have an MSP strategy to either figure out how to develop MSP business or how to be a member of a supply base, because it's the largest growth sector in our market, and we can't ignore it. I remember there was, when probably 15 years ago, it started to have some, I suppose, get some traction in the Irish market. There was almost a sense from suppliers, as in recruitment companies, that they would say, look, if another agency has won a particular MSP, well, we're not going to supply into it. And actually, that's a very short-term view, because I think we've reached a much more collaborative space, because the MSP model, which is not vendor neutral, is the one that can be most beneficial to an organization, where you've got an MSP holder that is responsible for the compliance, the onboarding, the rate card management, etc. And maybe this is why the MSP strategy is important. You should always go for an MSP in an area that's close to your sweet spot, where you know that you can deliver maybe 80% or 90% of the recs directly, and then have a really excellent supply base for to work with you on the areas that are outside of your specialism. Because ultimately, if you're the MSP provider, you live and die by the sword. You've got to meet your SLAs, you've got to meet your commercials, you've got to have your tech stack right in terms of data analytics, because now clients have become far more discerning. They want a monthly report. Like when you compare it to the old days, an organization that had 100 contractors from 20 or 30 different agencies had a huge amount of invoices coming in, a huge amount of validation of timesheets and work that was done, no visibility of rate card management, very little visibility of margin. And now organizations can have hundreds of contractors and receive one invoice that shows exactly how many starters there were in the month or in the quarter, how many finishers, how many rate increase requests, what was the performance, how are expenses being managed, what were their overtime claims. They can control whether overtime, whether weekend hours are open to contractors or not, depending on the program of work to be delivered. So it takes a bit of work to get to that stage. That's why I think the MSP strategy has to be, first of all, start as a member of a supply base and understand how the contract works, understand the SLAs, because it takes a bit of time to build that competence before you actually go and try to win an MSP yourself. And there's also the cash flow implication of it. 500 contractors at 500 euros per day. If you're cash flowing that through a business, is a significant draw on resources, particularly when your contractors need to be paid at the end of each month, but you might have 45 days payment terms with a multinational client. So there's all those considerations to think about as well.
It's from an operational perspective, the MSP from certain clients kind of does sound quite appealing. I think, and we never said at the start, but kind of, folks, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A or the chat function, and we're happy to kind of answer them. Donal, talk to us a little bit kind of the economics of kind of contingent workforce and kind of how kind of some benefits of building one, or kind of how to go about building one kind of.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because that's one of the things that I tried to think about. And actually what I wanted to do, rather than take it on the large level where we're thinking about, how an organization looks at it, I want to look at it initially on a desk level, if I can, because I know that we have some people on the call today that are, maybe that have started in contract recruitment in the past year. And one of the things that can be difficult when you start in contract recruitment is working alongside permanent recruiters. And that's with no disrespect to permanent recruiters. But if you think about this, recruiters typically make 2 placements a month. A bad month, it might be 1 placement. A good month might be 3 or 4 placements. But typically, we expect 2 placements a month from a recruitment consultant. If you're a perm recruiter, your average recruitment fee might be £7,500 or €7,500. And with 2 placements a month, 15,000 a month, which equates to 180,000 a year. Okay. If you're a contractor or a temp recruiter and you make 2 placements a month, your revenue in the early days is very, very small. So it can be disheartening to see somebody putting 15 grand on the board beside you when you have 2 grand on the board for doing effectively the same work. You're taking a requirement, you're going to market, you're bringing it to life, and essentially finding the right person for your client's organization. So what I wanted to do, I've got this little slide here, which is a snapshot of building a contractor desk, building your GP, your gross profit or your net fee income for a new contract recruiter. So this is very basic in terms of the numbers, but it's just to give people that are new to the sector an idea of how to grow a desk. So the assumptions that I'm making with this slide is that we're going to work off an average margin of 15%. And to achieve an average margin of 15%, you have to have some work that's a little bit higher, some work that's a little bit lower. So I've said spot business is done at 18%. Spot business are the customers that come to you occasionally, but not regularly. So the margin there might be 18%. Shorts at 25%. A short is an example where an organization comes to you looking for a very specific skill set, but they might only need the person to work 8 weeks or 12 weeks. So your resourcing costs are the same, whether the person works 12 weeks or 6 months. So your margin must be higher to compensate you for finding that person for that organization. PSL work, I've put in at 15%. That's probably the bulk of your work. They're your regular customers that you have a preferred supplier relationship with. And then MSP, I've put in at 8.5%, where you are holding an MSP for a particular organization, and you now control all of the recs. And the decision is yours whether to deliver directly or whether to work with your agency supply base. So that's a little bit about how to manage to get your average margin of 15%. But for this calculation, we're going to take the assumption it's like an IT recruitment desk where we're paying our contractor €350 a day. We're applying our 15% margin, which means our charge is €411.76 per day. It gives you a margin value per day of 61.76. And we're making the assumption that the contractor works 20 days in the month, 4 or 5 day weeks. We're going to imagine that our consultant makes 2 to 3 placements a month. What we want to get is a net gain of 2 contractors per month. Okay, so 2 new to add each month. And that brings us to the lovely alligator mouth that you'll see here behind me. In this scenario, you'll see that in the early days, the recruiter is, the billings are with the first 2 placements. If the contractors work a full month, it's about 2.4K per month. But if we're getting that net gain of 2 per month, you'll see the tipping point kind of hits 6 months in. So we often say it takes 6 months to get to productivity, whether you're a permanent or a non-permanent recruiter. Around the 6-month mark, it's 14,800, about 15 grand in gross profit. And you'll see that continues all the way through. Now, this is a very simple way of calculating this. You'll have other positives that'll happen during your building your contract desk, like conversions to perm, where you'll get a decent fee. Equally, you'll have times where you'll have more attrition. You might have 3 or 4 contractors on a particular project that comes to an end. You might have a higher level of attrition. It's about making sure that you've got enough coming in to meet that attrition number. And I think the positive thing about this, when we look at the next slide, is that for a consultant, if they can achieve these kind of numbers, and if they can stay on top of being really all over the numbers, knowing what their average pay rate is, knowing what their average margin is, mixing that product mix so that you've got a good mix of margin, and hitting that net gain of 2 contractors per month, this results in a year 1 performance of 190K, which is a solid year 1 performance and gives a very strong platform going into year 2. If you can imagine that the person continues that for a 4-year period, it results in that $1 million, €1 million desk, which is often talked about as the holy grail. So there, Dave, is a very quick snapshot on the commercials of how to build a contract desk.
I really like that kind of building. You can see kind of how it can be possible to get to that all elusive €1 million or $1 million contract desk. Okay.
And you got to be. I think that's the thing that's slightly different from permanent recruitment, is that the pace is a little bit different. In permanent recruitment, okay, you can develop expertise in a particular area. So when a requisition is given to you, you may have an idea, or a strong network, or know that you've got candidates that have been met and screened, but there's still an element of having to go to market, advertise, search, and so on. I think when we think about contract delivery, we're typically working off an SLA of 3 CVs within 48 hours. So I think for people that want to develop that type of really specific contract desk, you've just constantly got to be talking to your candidates and having candidate pools that are ready to mobilize, that if an organization opens 3 or 4 requisitions to you, that you can move quickly, because it is certainly competitive.
Yeah, I definitely see the speed from our side of the table. So we don't know kind of what goes on kind of usually kind of on your side, but when kind of we interact with recruitment consultants, there's that need for speed. Kind of they're looking for the compliance documents kind of immediately. Kind of they put the candidate in touch. We'll have a conversation with them, and then quite often kind of later days, can we get documents? Can we get documents? And that's probably what you're referring there. Kind of where kind of you have that SLA where you have to kind of have a certain amount of time in order to place the candidate. Yeah,
well, we've got SLAs for everything. So if you think about if you're an MSP holder, you've got the SLAs in terms of the time to take your briefing from the hiring manager, when you're going to have your, for example, 3 CVs per rec back to them, or so on like that. But then once the offer is made, the whole compliance and onboarding process, particularly if you're providing services in financial services, retail banking, general insurance, life and pensions, anyone that's regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland, there's a very heavy burden on compliance. And there's an SLA that will apply to the MSP holder and the supply base to get those documents back. So that's why we like working with Fenero as an example, because I know that if a contractor is referred and has a call with the solutions team in Fenero and the person signs up, I know that I'm going to same day get a pack that's going to include the certificate of incorporation, the VAT registration, the insurance, the company bank details. So that ticks probably 5 boxes for me, but there's another 10 boxes in terms of compliance that need to be checked in terms of right to work, proof of address, insolvency searches, depending, or different elements of compliance. So it's definitely helpful to have a partner that's on the ball for that type of thing.
Yeah, we appreciate the need for speed. We try to get them across within 20 minutes of the contractor signing up, but we have an SLA of 1 hour. So try to aim for 20 minutes, but sometimes it can take a little bit longer.
Dave, sorry, just to say, I've just seen a question pop in from Chloe Walsh there that looks like a really good one. And it's a question that I get, and I know you get asked quite regularly. It's, what's your view? Is there a particular salary band for candidates where the consultant should be advising the person to go as a contractor rather than a PAYE temp? So Chloe has said, for example, if the person's salary expectation was 70K, do you think they're better off going? That's a loaded question, Dave. Do you think they're better off going as a contractor?
So it does. I do look at the daily rates, and I do look at salary. Ideally, I have a €200 daily rate. Anything below that, I think temp should be considered. The higher the candidates, the higher the contractor daily rates, the more they can take advantage of the benefits that contracting gives. So the €200 is around 50,000. So I think 50,000, possibly think temp over 50,000. The higher, the more you get, the more beneficial it would be for a contractor.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would just caveat that by saying, depending on if the decision sits with the recruitment organization, in a scenario like that, I would lean towards a professional contractor, just because I know the person will be able to maximize their business expenses. They might be able to, what's that small, your all for one voucher, what's that thing called? A
small gift.
Yeah, the small, like little things like that, where there's tax efficient ways of working as a professional contractor. But then sometimes, like we've had instances again in semi-state and public sector where it's not an option, where the requirement comes in, this person needs to be paid a salary of 70K. They need to have, for example, 25 or 26 days annual leave and comparable treatment. So in that situation, it's sometimes the decision happens for you from the client side. And then if the decision sits with you, and again, it depends what the candidate is happy with as well. So I think it's always good to consider both. You can consider what it would look like to be on the agency payroll. And then it's also worthwhile talking to somebody in Fenero to see how beneficial it might be in terms of a gross to net calculation for take home and how to maximize that earning potential.
Just touching basing on the green shoots, Donal, and coming out of the pandemic. One of the challenges that we come across is trying to not convince, but advise candidates who've never contracted before. So never contracted, always been perm. They're looking at taking on contract roles. They have that little bit of nervous, they're losing perhaps the perceived security. How does that conversation go on your side of the table?
It depends on the consultant. And I think this is where education and training are really important, because what I see in organizations is that if the consultant, like say, for example, if you're talking to an IT recruiter, and we know that a lot of IT talent work as professional contractors, and that recruitment consultant is used to speaking to professional contractors day in and day out, and they're very good at answering the commonly asked questions around social welfare entitlements, should the person end up being unemployed in the future, or if they're asked questions about retention or maximizing business expenses or whatever like that, they might steer people in that direction. Sometimes you'll find that if somebody's on a desk and they're just more used to dealing with temporary agency workers, they'll say, look, we have an opportunity, the salary is this, and it'll be on the agency payroll. And they might necessarily do the compare and contrast piece. So it really varies. I think one of the things that's important to do, and I see another question coming in there asking, what's our opinion? Do we recommend that the person talks to one provider or multiple providers when they're looking for compliance, and what's the reason for it? I could just give my experience with this is that we tried to stay as impartial as possible. We went through a PSL process to make sure that any accountancy firms that were providing services to contractors that are part of our contractor population met with our requirements. And then, so we form a PSL. I think then what you tend to see happen in organizations is that depending on how responsive the accountancy firm is, like Dave gave the example there of if someone talks to their solutions team and that there's a pack back in 20 minutes, that certainly makes the recruiter's job a little bit easy. So I think a PSL is a good way to start off. And then I think a bit like the way organizations manage their recruitment PSL, the best organizations rise to the top, and relationship management comes into play, and ultimately the job that's done. And the relationship between the operations teams is important as well, because if you have your finance team, for example, managing contractor payments for 50 or 100, 200 contractors, they'll soon find who are efficient in terms of invoicing, whether self-bill or invoice-raised systems are used. So I think you probably start by handpicking maybe 2 providers or something like that, and then see where you go from there. But impartiality should certainly play a role. What's your view, Dave? Just Fenero, or
no? Like, and put my Fenero hat aside, I kind of disagree a little bit with it. And what I'm looking at is it's kind of like the MSP model. You find one really good provider and you work closer with that provider. Okay, you're gonna you have your initial kind of PSL, and but the best will rise to the top. And then my view is create a strategic partnership with that company. And we do this with our IT and stuff like that. We find really good one, and get rid of the rest. Everything goes through them, and just the teams work better together. So I see the argument, but from experience, the companies that we've worked with, the closer the relationship we have, the better, and the better for our clients.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
Obviously, Fenero should be that one, but.
And you see a bit of everything, though, because you'll see sometimes you'll have a contractor that's contracted before and they might have a relationship with a particular provider. Sometimes you'll see that contractors in a particular organization, that word of mouth spreads that they had a really good experience, or it was very easy to use the Fenero platform, for example, for managing their expenses or something like that. And word of mouth comes to play. And I think relationship management, very similar to in the recruitment business, plays a big role as well. But if you're really good at what you do and you're easy to do business with, I think the cream definitely rises to the top.
Very good. I know
might go on to, sorry, David, I don't mean to cut across. I was just going to say that I think it might be useful just to tease out a little bit on the MSP strategy piece, because I know we had a lot of interest from people as we said that we were going to run this session, and the MSP strategy was questions that I just kept getting through again and again. So one of the things that I wanted to share is, let me just see. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that if it's too small, but some of the things to think about is this is one of the fastest growing segments in our global market for recruitment organizations. And one of the things that's really important to think about is the impact that it has on your organization's value. So when we think we've just come out of, or we're coming out of this downturn, and the organizations that managed to retain their value and weather the downturn are the ones that had a strong kind of contingent workforce strategy. When you look at the SIA's reports in terms of mergers and acquisitions, IPOs, the organizations that are most valuable in our business are the ones that have that embedded contingent workforce, because we know that if we start looking at the value of a recruitment business that's purely focused on permanent recruitment, that revenue can be hard to protect after an acquisition should the principals of that organization complete their earnout and then move on. If an organization has a large contract and temp book, it has more, I suppose, predictable and easily to forecast revenue over a sustained period of time, so it has more value. But where you've got an embedded MSP, and MSP contracts can be 3 or 5 year contracts, that's where you can really drive high value in the organization, whether it's for an IPO or whether it's for an exit for the organization's principals. The things to think about that, though, are that your relationship management needs to change. Together with having line management and HR as your stakeholders, you've really got to bring procurement into the mix and supplier relationship management, because the MSP has got to think about managing and simplifying the complexity of compliance. It's got to think about requisition management. You've got to have some legal expertise to make sure that you've got that rigor around your contract management to be able to manage the contracts of the contractor population that you might migrate or inherit from a previous provider. You've also got to look at your invoice management and your tech stack to have really good data analytics to be able to offer your new MSP host organization the insights that they need around where is their contractor spend, where is their rate card management, is there any rogue spend. You've got to offer significant market intelligence, and you've got to be moving ahead and adding value. So this year, for example, we're seeing the emergence of a lot of mentor programs operating within MSPs, because the risk to some organizations is that they invest all this money in bringing in contract expertise, and when the contractor leaves the organization, that knowledge leaves with them. So there are programs that recruitment organizations and MSP providers are putting in place to make sure that the contractors are mentoring some of the permanent staff within the organization. So there's a knowledge transfer. So these are some of the value adds I think organizations need to think about in terms of risk management, in terms of bringing diversity and inclusion strategies into the contractor population. So working closely with HR to make sure that things that are being rolled out in the permanent organization have some impact as well within the contractor population as well. So just some things to think about. It's not just about driving the price down and giving better economies of scale. It's about data, insights, making sure that the best talent is brought in the most efficient and easy to manage way for your end client.
That's really good, Donal. Right, I'm conscious of time. Okay, another question there.
Very good.
Okay, so that was his response. Are you conscious? Is there anything else, Donal, that's?
Anything else to talk about on the evolution of the different models? I think I would just encourage organizations to invest in dedicated contract recruiters, because because everybody's saying, look, how do we build our temp book? How do we build our contractor population? How do we build an MSP? And what I would say is you need to start with your sweet spot. So look at where your temps and where your contractors are currently working and see if you can do a carve out project for a particular client. So if you know an organization has a propensity to bring in, for example, finance temps at year end, or to bring in people for IT development or migration projects, I think organizations need to be a little bit strategic in terms of going and proposing good commercial deals to carve out a piece of work where you can deliver that particular piece of work. So I think being a little bit strategic in that space, investing in dedicated contract recruiters is definitely important. And then I would also encourage recruiters that are largely permanent focused to sometimes recommend, if there's a requisition that's going to take a while to fill, that you're sometimes recommending bringing in somebody on an interim basis, or recommending somebody that wants to move from one sector to another, that they try an interim assignment and that you market some people out like that. Because together with helping people to access the labor market with that try before you buy mentality, you're going to support your own desk. If you can, for example, cover your costs and have a few €1,000s of temp or contract revenue to build from, and then your permanent placement gives you your contribution towards profit after that, it certainly takes a lot of the pressure off when the market circumstances change.
That makes a lot of sense, Donal. Kind of having a little bit in each pot.
Definitely.
Okay.
And it's definitely the mentality, and that's why I wanted to do the silly alligator mouth. It's the mentality for a contract recruiter is, I think, if you can get that net gain of 2 contractors per month, and just sometimes you have to give a little bit on the margin. Sometimes there'll be spot business where you'll make a little bit more, but if you're fair and if you can just develop contractor populations and then suggest really good people to your clients, it's very, very doable.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose in summary, in terms of kind of wanted to do, I probably should have did a decision tree for the junior recruiters there, kind of when you're talking to or deciding whether to place kind of somebody as a temporary agency worker or a contractor. If you're hearing kind of the client saying equal treatment principle, kind of, I'm very focused on that, you go temp. if there's possibility of it going over 23 months, possibly consider kind of going contractor. And then from the candidate's perspective, if they're really focused on their retention and their daily rate is above €200 or 50,000 salary, it'd be good to consider limited company contracting.
Yeah, definitely. And also it depends what the candidate's aspiration is. Some candidates are likely to follow the work that they're interested in, and will move between contract and perm if they like the sound of a project or a piece of work, or they want to work for a particular organization. And then some people get to a particular stage where maybe they have their 10 or 15 years work experience done on the permanent side of things, and they now want to leverage their experience and to build a more of a portfolio career where you're getting experience from contract to contract. And it can be lucrative, because what we're seeing in the market is that contractors at the moment are earning between 30 and 40% more than their permanent equivalents. So there's definitely commercially a benefit to it as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Donal, for sharing your insights and expertise today. And if anybody has any questions or assistance with your contingent workforce, please reach out to the team at Fenero at hello@fenero.ie, and we'll be happy to answer any question, both on temp, on contracts, and even kind of on perm. Kind of, if any questions, touch base with us.
Dave, I'm seeing that a lot of people are asking for the slides. So I know I was speaking to Claire in Fenero, and she was talking about maybe sending out a short kind of email or a survey. Maybe we could get some slides out to the participants as well, and some follow-up information. That'd be great.
Yep, we'll definitely kind of include those slides in that.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thank you, Dave. I know you were up until I got an email from you in the wee small hours of the morning. So thanks for all the prep you put into this, and great to see you. And thank you, everybody, for your interest and for attending.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.